In the Middle East, things can always get worse and often do. And we're going into this new crisis now without the kind of statesmen that used to be able to pull opportunity from calamity.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. After years of threats, the Israeli government launched a major attack targeting both Iran's nuclear program and several senior Iranian military and political leaders. At time of recording, Iran had yet to respond in a major way, though the expectation is that the regime will hit back, and much harder than it did last year after a previous and more limited Israeli strike on Iran. The key question now, according to my guest today, Barbara Slavin, is whether this inspires Iran to gather the nuclear material it has and make a sprint towards weaponizing its stockpiles of enriched uranium and becoming a nuclear weapons state. Barbara Slavin is a longtime journalist and think tank expert focusing on Iran and U.S. Iran relations. She's a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center and the editor of Middle East Perspectives. We kick off by discussing what Israel's target list suggests about its intentions behind these major strikes, before having a longer conversation about what Iran's response may entail and what role the United States might play in a widening conflict in the Middle East. This conversation is obviously very timely and will give you helpful context for understanding events in the region as they unfold over the coming days and weeks. I learned a lot from Barbara Slavin, and I suspect you will as well. And one just quick note before we start, I do want to encourage you to become a paid supporter of this show. There are links in the show notes of this episode that will get you a discount to a paid subscription at globaldispatches.org. But more to the point, you would be helping me do what I do. I require listener support, audience support to keep this show going. So thank you. Now here is my conversation with Barbara Slavin of the Stimson Center. Thanks so much for joining me today. Obviously, it has been an eventful, not even 24 hours, 12 hours, really. To kick off, can I have you just explain to me what the targets that Israel selected in Iran suggest to you about their intentions behind this military action?
Well, they have decapitated the Iranian military. They have killed pretty much every senior Iranian general. They have gone after the Natanz uranium enrichment site, which is Iran's main site for enriching uranium. They have not, as far as I know, gone after more deeply buried sites like Fordo, which they would need U.S. support, frankly, and cooperation in order to hit. They have destroyed a major airfield in Tabriz. They're going after missile launch sites and any remaining defensive sites that Iran might have. It's quite extraordinary. It's continuing as we speak. In going after the senior leadership of the Iranian military, they hit residential neighborhoods and they killed civilians, including children. It is massive. They have not gone after the supreme leader of the country, but they have definitely hit the military leadership, including the head of the Quds Force, which is an elite force within the Iranian military. So it is quite sweeping. The Iranians, I think, are stunned by the extent of this strike and also the amount of deception that was practiced by the United States in essentially covering up almost until the last minute what the Israeli intentions were. I mean, Trump was still talking about peace talks while the Israelis were getting ready for this.
What has been the Iranian response thus far? It seems, at least, it's sort of a state of shock as you describe it,
Yeah.
but has there been any meaningful political or diplomatic response yet by the Iranian government?
Yeah, well, first, they have sent a bunch of drones up against Israel, but they've all been apparently shot down, or at least that's what the Israelis are claiming. They lodged a very strong protest at the UN Security Council, a lot of good, at the UN anyway, a lot of good that'll do them. They've lodged a very strong response at the International Atomic Energy Agency, which just censored them the other day for continuing to fail to meet up to their obligations under their safeguards agreement with the IAEA. They have elicited some statements of support from Saudi Arabia, Oman, some of the other Arab countries, which at least are in public acting sympathetic. The Chinese and the Russians have also condemned this, but frankly, they appear to have been caught really flat footed by all of this.
What do you expect Iran's response to be militarily? We did see, last year an exchange of kinetic military action between Iran and Israel that seemed to be just like a one-off incident. This seems to be a bit more profound a strike. How are you interpreting what Iran might do next?
I'm looking to see what they do in the nuclear file. Iranians, have amassed enough nuclear material for perhaps 10 nuclear weapons. I don't know where it's stored. I don't know if the Israelis somehow managed to hit it, but there is enough material for 10 weapons. Will the Iranians now covertly try to turn some of that into a nuclear weapon? Will they quit the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty? Will they kick out remaining inspectors and completely shut down all their cooperation with the IAEA? I mean, I think that is really the most
Mhm.
concerning issue, not whether they send some more drones against the Israelis. I would think in the longer term, there will be acts of terrorism and actions by Iran backed groups like the militias in Iraq, perhaps the Houthis in Yemen. And of course, they will definitely try to marshal support in developing countries against both the United States and
Mhm.
Israel, arguing that this was not a preemptive or preventive strike by Israel, but an outrageous act of aggression.
It seems that conventional wisdom for a long time has been that Iran's nuclear facilities are sufficiently fortified that a strike on them wouldn't necessarily set back their nuclear programs too deeply and might conversely inspire them to sprint towards the bomb. As you mentioned earlier, they do have many sources have reported enough material for at least 10 nuclear weapons if they wanted to make that sprint. So you're looking towards whether or not that sprint will commence in the near term.
Yeah, I think that's really the key question. Of course, they're kind of in a lose lose situation. If they do that, then they're likely to be attacked before they can get to the stage of weaponizing, assuming they don't have a bomb in the basement already. And I don't think they do. The other question is whether the Israelis will try to get the United States to join them in Bomb Fordo, which is their deeply buried facility that has a lot of their advanced centrifuges, whether they have other sites that we don't know about. But that is a possibility. I think, as I say, they are still in a state of shock, and I'm not sure they're going to be able to focus on this. Right now, they are trying to marshal both domestic opinion and international opinion against the Israeli strikes, which, after all, come in the context of Israel killing 55,000 Palestinians in Gaza over the last 20 months. And even though in the United States that might not seem that controversial for some, I can assure you it is in other parts of the world.
Mhm.
So, the Israelis look like they're riding high, but they may have overreached. And we will see what this does to the image of Israel in the world.
Why do you suspect this happened now? I mean, since April, there has been actual meaningful talks between the United States and Iran on the nuclear program. And this is a sharp contrast to the first Trump administration, in which there were no meaningful talks, in which the Trump administration pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, and Iran subsequently, amassed sufficiently enriched uranium to produce those 10 bombs that we discussed. But this time around, there really did seem to be a genuine interest in striking a deal, to the point where there's supposed to be, a meeting in Oman over the weekend. Why now do you suspect Israel chose to strike and strike the manner that it did?
Yeah, well, Trump gave the process, such as it was, 2 months, 60 days, and that expired. So, we've called him Taco. Trump always chickens out. Usually Bibi always chickens out, Netanyahu, that is, if we want to call him Baco, because he's been threatening to hit Iran for as long as I can remember. But this time, no. And the US did give Iran a proposal, but it was not acceptable to the Iranians. It required them to end all uranium enrichment. And Iran has consistently refused to do that. Trump, I guess, thinks he's the big tough guy now. But I think that a lot of his followers are going to be feeling very betrayed by this because he promised no more wars. And instead, we have 3 wars raging, and the US has failed to end any of them.
There's this kind of, it seems like a parlor game this morning around DC. Like, did Trump know? Did the White House know?
Of course, he knew. We've been withdrawing non essential personnel from the Middle East for the last few days. Trump spoke with Bibi on Sunday. I mean, this is not a surprise for him.
Do you expect Iran to retaliate against American interests in the region? And what do you suspect that might look like?
I think the Iranians are going to be a bit cautious about that because they are afraid that that might incentivize the United States to join with the Israelis and go after Fordo and other sites in Iran. When Americans are killed, Trump responds. You may remember in his first term, he killed Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, after an American contractor was killed in Iraq. And I believe some of the pro-Iran Iraqi militias surrounded the US embassy in Baghdad, and Trump feared he was going to have a hostage situation like the Iran hostage crisis on his hands. So he authorized the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. I think the Iranians are well aware that going after purely American targets could be extremely dangerous for them. But, there can be acts of terrorism that are hard to attribute. And that's what I really worry about. I worry about it for Americans overseas in the Middle East. I worry about it for American Jews, for European Jews who may be targeted, even though they have nothing to do with Israel or Israeli policies. And of course, we've already seen this tremendous upsurge in anti-Semitic attacks and rhetoric since the Gaza war started.
What sort of regional dynamics do you see unfolding in the next few days, few weeks? It seemed at least that the Gulf states, Iran, the UAE, they did not want this outcome. They wanted a more peaceful future in the region, or at least one that did not include a wider regional role. How are you viewing their responses thus far and their interests?
Well, they're making very measured statements at this point, and I think they're very, very concerned about the possibility that this will widen and that there will be attacks on their economic interests, as occurred back in 2019 after Trump quit the Iran nuclear deal the first time around. But they all have restored relations with Iran since then, and I'm sure they're communicating to the Iranians, please don't go after us. It wasn't our doing. It's not our fault. And Iran has enough enemies on its hands right now. I'm not sure it wants to antagonize the GCC states at this point. This is different, so different from 2019. I don't think we're going to see that playbook again. But Iran is going to claim that it's the aggrieved partner, that it was negotiating in good faith, and the nefarious Israelis, backed by the nefarious Americans, did this to them.
I wanted to go back to your point you made earlier that one of the key inflection points you're looking towards in the coming days really is whether or not Iran does seek to, say withdraw from the non-proliferation treaty and make that sprint to weaponizing its nuclear program. If it does do that, how does that change dynamics in the Middle East? How does that change the region?
Well, the question is whether they'd be successful, whether the Israelis have already done so much damage to them that they're not capable of doing that. And I simply don't know. I don't know the extent of their technical infrastructure in that direction right now. If they were to succeed in making a couple of bombs, I think it would have definitely an impact because, that would make Israel vulnerable to a potential nuclear attack. Or the Iranians might go after Dimona, the Israeli reactor, or other Israeli nuclear installations. I mean, it could get very, very dangerous very quickly. So that's why I say we have to watch this space. There's a need for de-escalation, but the Iranians are also going to want revenge. These are absolutely devastating attacks on their facilities and on their personnel.
It seems at least, part of the motivation here by the Israelis based on the targets that they chose was to further destabilize the Iranian regime. To what extent might they have been successful? And is the Iranian government right now just very weak, and might it indeed fall?
I think the Iranian government is weak, but another question I have is whether these attacks actually strengthen the Iranian government by provoking a patriotic response among Iranians who are not used to having bombs fall on their neighborhoods. That is possible. And again, I'm not in Iran. I haven't been there for a decade. I correspond with folks who are there, and they say the initial response has been patriotic. But at the same time, the Iranian government is cracking down, slowing the internet, and taking various steps to try to minimize dialogue and conversation with the outside world and so on. I think when we talk about the potential for regime change in Iran, the question is what would come next? Now, the Israelis may not care. They may be perfectly happy to have another failed state in the Middle East. But there is no leader of the Iranian opposition within the country that would be ready to step in. People who look to the son of the former Shah who lives in Potomac, Maryland, are
Yeah.
deluding themselves.
Yeah.
The guy he's not Shah material, I'm sorry, or anything close. These attacks, of course, have also caused a lot of consternation among Iranians, not only in Iran, but in the diaspora, where some folks are absolutely furious at what the Israelis have done. And even if there are some who quietly cheer them on, they may not be really willing to come out and say that right now because it
Mhm.
looks a little bit indelicate at the least. So, the Iranian state, people have been predicting its fall for so long. When it happens, but it hasn't happened yet. And I think that there is still, they've replaced all the generals who were killed. There are others who've moved on up. And I think that there is still sufficient power within the regime that they will hold together and try to exploit this, frankly, for their own benefit.
So I do want to ask you about opportunities for de-escalation right now. I mean, it seems far-fetched at the moment to think that there might be any impending de-escalation, considering how recent this is and how prepared we are for further escalation. But do you see any opportunities to walk the de-escalatory ladder here? You're shaking your head no.
Yeah, it's really hard to see at this point. I think there's going to be a lot of tension for a long time. The Iranians are not going to now accept the deal that they rejected from Trump because that would be too much of a humiliation. Compromise in this situation would be absolute political suicide for the Islamic Republic. So I don't see it. I just wrote a commentary for the Stimson Center. I don't know if they'll keep this line in, but my kicker at the end was that, in the Middle East, things can always get worse and often do. And we're going into this new crisis now without the kind of statesmen that used to be able to pull opportunity from calamity. There are no Henry Kissingers, there are no Jim Bakers running around trying to bring peace to the Middle East. We have a bunch of, let's just say I'm not impressed with the Trump team. I don't
Mhm.
think Steve Witkoff is proven to be a
Yeah.
great peacemaker. He may be very good at selling real estate, but he's not going to bring peace to the Middle East. So I'm very worried.
I think that point is so important. I mean, there does not seem to be a foreign policy process
No.
in the Trump administration. There's no national security advisor.
Oh, we have Marco Rubio. He can do
Well,
everything, right? He and
sure.
Witkoff.
Yeah. I mean, at least, the messaging from the Trump administration or from Trump himself over the last week, I told Bibi not to a strike, but then he did.
He was
It,
lying.
it seems that, the line I keep saying, there was no red line conveyed. And you seem to suggest that this was done with the tacit approval of the Trump administration.
Absolutely. There's no way that Netanyahu would have done this without at least U.S. acquiescence.
Hmm.
And of course, the U.S. is standing by to protect Israel against
Hmm.
any Iranian retaliation. So we are in this very deep. And Trump lied to all the people who voted for him, thinking he was going to bring peace to the Middle East and peace to Ukraine.
Can I ask, just to wrap up? I mean, you mentioned the big outstanding question for you is how Iran recalibrates its approach to potentially weaponizing its nuclear program. Are there any other events, any other inflection points in the coming days and weeks that you'll be looking towards, both on the Israeli side, on the American side, and on the Iranian side, that will suggest to you the manner in which the situation may unfold over the coming days and weeks?
Yeah, I know. I'm looking for the weaponization issue. I'm looking for whether they kick out what remains of the IEA monitoring and whether they hunker down. And you may remember at the end of the 90s, after the U.S. bombed Iraq, the Iraqis kicked out remaining inspectors, and the U.S. was in the dark about what the Iranian nuclear program was. And that, of course, was one of the factors in the Iraq invasion of 2003. The George W. Bush administration was able to say that Iraq was reconstituting its nuclear program, and nobody was in a position to say no. They did let some inspectors back in for a brief period, but George W. Bush didn't want to hear that they hadn't found anything, and he used this as a pretext to invade Iraq. So I'm worried about going into this sort of dark space where we know even less than we do now about the program, and that the neocons who are always lurking in the shadows will use this as an excuse to prod Trump to join with the Israelis in even more devastating strikes on Iran.
Well, Barbara, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time on this extraordinarily busy and frantic day for you. I do appreciate you taking the time to speak with me.
Glad to. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.